This is a game I've played in the second to last tournament I played in, and it was my first round robin invitational, where you play, in a 10-man group for International Master Norms. And it was my first tournament back in about a year. I was certainly rusty when it came to the tactical elements of the game. But I did, in that tournament, play some very nice positional games. And this is one of them. And I was very proud about this game. It wasn't just my best game of that tournament. It was probably my best game in like a couple years. So he played the move d5 and I played g3. He played the move g6. I played bishop to g2. And here we have a Grunfeld. A Grunfeld fianchetto variation if black plays the move knight to f6, which I expected Aaron to play, and that would be a main line, one of the main lines after the move pawn to c4. He instead played a slightly unorthodox move, and the third most popular move, knight to h6, which is not absurd. The idea of knight to h6 is to bring the knight to the f5 square, and even potentially to the d6 square, clamping down on the central squares. So I castled. I didn't see that I had a better move to play than castle. He played the move knight to f5 and pawn to c3, securing the center. And here is where I decided that I really wanted to play the move pawn to e4. I didn't want to play the move pawn to c4 because I was afraid that my d-pawn would become a little bit weak, and I didn't want to play pawn e3 because I didn't want to block in my bishop on c1. So I played pawn to c3, and I'm going to try to play e4. So he played knight to d6, spent quite a bit of time rerouting that knight. We're still following a few higher level games. I played knight to d2, and he played the move knight to d7, and then I played the move pawn to e5. The reason why I played pawn to c3 is because I want to blunt this bishop. And generally speaking, you don't put your knight on c3 blocking your c-pawn. The c-pawn is either used to bolster the center or later attack the center. So c3 is more natural with knight to d2. And then Aaron certainly wanted to play the move knight to f6, clamping down on the e4 break. So I decided to play e4 anyway, and this is still following 3 games. So we're still following those other games. This is exactly what happened in the other games. And after this move, we had a series of exchanges, and we get to this position. And this is kind of where I'd like to start. And we're still following the game Gonda versus Schmidt. So I simply played bishop to f4. And here's the way I saw this position. I knew I was better in this position, but I didn't know how much. I just knew I had an advantage. So from here on out, I tried to nurse what I believe to be my advantage. So I have space, and I have development. So he played the move pawn to c6, which blunts my bishop, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, that pawn's a target. So pawn to c6 to blunt my bishop, and then I played the move queen to b3. Again, being as annoying as possible. I know he wants to move this bishop, so I'm tying it down temporarily. Aaron played the move queen to b6, which I would say is pretty normal. If Aaron had the next move, he would play the move bishop to e6 and begin developing his pieces, and I didn't want that to happen, so I played the move d5. And part of the reason I played the move d5 is if he captures, he still has a hell of a time developing. Because if he develops this bishop, I can take the queen and then take the pawn on b7. Now that this bishop is actually open, I remove the pawn on c6. The pawn on c6 served a very important role into neutralizing this bishop. Now, the queen side's coming under heavy fire. It's going to be very difficult for black to develop this remainder of his army. So capturing is kind of what I was hoping for. I certainly don't mind the queen trade because that only allows me the open rook file, and I still have immense pressure here. I mean, this is almost, I would say, a winning position concretely for white. It's going to be hard for black to avoid losing material here. Because how do you develop? Like, you're getting blazed everywhere. So I certainly wasn't afraid of the queen trade because I thought it only helped me. It only helped me accelerate development by opening up my rook. So he played bishop to d7, which makes sense to me because he wants to trade. Like, he wants me to go here. And then, like, we started trading pieces and the game is getting closer and closer to a draw. So I was like, nah. That pawn is your worst nightmare because it's in your face, it's in your way, and I keep you guessing, right? I'm like, every moment I could take on c6, and maybe I advance the pawn. Like, I keep you guessing. So I was, like, as Alan had suggested, I just brought my rooks into the center because I know the center is going to open. And I'm picking on this new target on the e7 square. And Aaron played rook to e8. I played rook to d1. And very harmonious position for white because the bishops are in the game, the pawn on d5 is cramping, and the rooks are really at their maximum. So, so he played e5. And now I have a question for you. Too en passant or not? Man, you guys are awesome today. Literally everyone said no. That's amazing. All right. So yeah, bishop to e3. The reason why you shouldn't en passant is then you only help black get development. Now what's black's weakness? Black is totally developed now. I mean, unless white has a knockout here, you've just thrown away the space advantage and the development lead. So I just went bishop to e3. There's no reason to take en passant. And as far as I saw it, that the pawn on e5 is just being blocked by the bishop, or is blocking the bishop. So again, this pawn is my homeboy pawn right here. Okay, I can trade when I feel like it. I can advance when I feel like it. I'm just going to leave it there. It's in his way. And when I want to open up, the position, I will. And, that's just the way that's going to work. Here he played a bad move fundamentally. And again, I hate to say that about my peers, but he did. Okay? He should trade queens. And the reason he should trade queens is because he's defending. And all my pieces are active. And if he loses more time by retreating the queen, which is what he did, he's only causing himself a greater disadvantage in tempo and development. So he should just trade the queens off because, his queen is under attack. He should trade the queens off and try to fight for some space with the move pawn to f5. But queen c7 was played, and I was like, I cannot believe. I was like, yes. I was like, when you're cramped, you lack space and you lack activity, you should trade. Like, that's when you trade. So what should I do here? I'm very proud of this move because it's the best move. Even by computer standards, it's the best move. Rook to d2. Wonderful. And even by computer standards, that's a good move. Like, it's the #1 move, according to Stockfish. So I'm happy about that. And basically, my rook on the e-file used to be good, at least I thought, because I was pressuring that e-pawn. But he advanced the e-pawn. It's not weak anymore. The pawn itself. I mean, the move hurts him, but the pawn itself is not weak. And so sometimes you just have to recognize in a positional game, you have to recognize, my pieces used to be well placed where they were, and now they aren't. So let's reposition. So rook to d2 followed by rook to d1. So pawn to b6, rook to d1, and again, I wasn't concerned about pawn c5, because if pawn c5 was a good move, I would not have played rook to d1. I would have traded first to ensure that the d file opens. But pawn to c5 is not a good move because of what? Now d6 is better because you win something. Brutal. So he took. I took. Now I have all sorts of threats. I'm attacking the rook. I'm attacking the pawn. My rooks are open. And in just a few moves, that space advantage has turned into a huge development advantage. You know, a piece activity advantage. White's pieces, my pieces, are, I mean, very well placed here. I mean, there's no attack per se, I mean, in the sense that, like, I'm going to checkmate him. But the pieces are simply just more active. Okay? So bishop e6 was played, which is natural. I took the bishop, and even though, of course, I don't necessarily want to trade per se, this buys me the time I need to utilize my rooks to the 7th rank. So rook takes, and rook to the 7th rank. And that in itself is not a very difficult move, so I'm not like overly proud of that move. And queen c6. Now, I am proud of this move. And it took me, I mean, I don't have the score sheet in front of me to see exactly how much time it took me to play this move. I do remember really having to convince myself that it was the right thing to do, because it was a little bit of a change of direction, but I eventually settled on it because it made sense to me. So what did I play? What's keeping Black's position together right now? I was like, it's definitely this queen. The queen is Black's best piece. This queen, unless I'm still dreaming about an attack on f7, which doesn't really seem very likely, then I really should trade the queens off. Because then when we're left with what we're left with, I dominate the only file, and I've got a rook on the 7th rank. So eventually I settled on this, but this was probably the longest think in the game for me, because it was a big decision to offer the queen trade. Because what that meant was I'm putting faith in a smaller army endgame because I'm much more developed. Like, my rooks are on the open files, and my bishop's better, and I have 3-on-2 on the queen side, and like all these kind of other factors. Cashing in the queens was the right thing to do. And so that's what happened. And he played king f8. Like, he was playing a lot of good defensive moves. He was just on the defensive the whole game. He definitely kept himself alive. But he just got a bad position kind of early and never really like worked his way out of it. In any endgame, there's one particular thing that you really need to look for. Because you have to remember that the ultimate goal in the endgame is the generation of a passed pawn. And and eventually its advancement to the other side. And so, what must you look for in every endgame if they exist? Very good, guys. Pawn majorities. Absolutely. The mobilization of the pawn majority and also the use of tactics in the endgame is very important, trying to foil his plans. So king to e8 was played. Very good move. Bishop to g5. I was trying to coerce the move f6. He didn't want any of that. I am threatening the opera house mate with the move rook to d8. Capture and capture. That's like Paul Morphy opera house game. Same checkmate. So he's like, all right, screw this. I'm going back. King f8. And now I played rook to c7. Because he cannot play rook e7 now, and I want to play here, which would be devastating. For example, if he goes h6, I still play here. because I'm going to scoop up everything on the 7th rank. Right? So something like this could happen. And then I win the bishop and like the game. So simple but strong, you know, kind of accurate. So he played e4, which I thought was a good move. And I thought about playing rook to d7 now. I didn't like the look of this. Like, I thought I was giving him unnecessary play, and I was tying around my rook. Like, for example, I thought something like, oh, no. I thought something like, what did I think would happen here, actually? This, because to my eyes right now, this looks pretty good, to be honest with you. I just didn't like the idea that I was letting him out, but I guess I'm not really letting him out because I'm kind of crushing his king there. But I instead played a typical Giannatos move, b3, not allowing any change in the status quo whatsoever. He played the move bishop to f6. I took, and then here I was very proud of the move that I played. So there's technically nothing wrong with going here. Okay? Like, in general. But I thought if I go there, he's going to do what? He goes rook to d8, keeping the pieces active. Screw this pawn, I'm going active. That's the way to play an endgame. And I didn't try this hard to let him off the hook like that. So I thought I played a pretty good move here. Another thing I didn't like was if I double up rooks on the 7th rank, I didn't like the look of this. Because I'm like, yeah, I can win this, and then he takes this, but I'm like, wait a minute. He was dead, and now I'm up a pawn, but he's alive? No. Capablanca school, right? We don't allow this garbage, okay? So I play king f1. I was like, you ain't playing e3 and getting active. That pawn is mine. I have time. I'm dominating the open files. I'm bringing my king into the game. You ain't getting any counterplay. He played a5 in search for counterplay. I played king to e2, played h5, and now I played rook c to d7, and the idea was this rook is the only thing kind of active. He might want to come here, so I'm like, I'll go here, going after these, trading off the active rook, and then, like I said, I'll bring my king into the game. And that's essentially what happened. So yeah, basically just denying counterplay. Rook c8 was played, and then I played rook to d6. Because my king will round up this pawn. I want to trade off his active rook. And at this point in time, it is quite a bit technical here. Rook to c6. I traded off the active rook, and I played rook to e5, winning the pawn. Now, there's no, even if he gets the file, it's only temporary. There's no infiltration squares on the file. So he played rook f3. I took the pawn. Played rook f5. And now it's a bit technical and not that hard. No infiltration. I mean, he could go to d1, but there's nothing there for him. The moment the rook goes to d1, these are all gone. So he played f6, rook to d5. And here he traded rooks into a losing king and pawn endgame. But, I mean, he's losing anyway. Because rook to e6, king to d2, there's no counterplay for him. And my next moves are going to be this. The mobilization of the majority. We already talked about that. In addition, I'm up a pawn. He traded the rooks, and now he's in a losing pawn endgame. And many roads lead to Athens here, but I'll just kind of show you how the game went. So we ran each other kind of out of pawn moves, and then I ditched the central pawn for the others, which is a very normal way to win when you're up a pawn in the endgame. And yeah, here if he queens, I trade, and then I promote this pawn. He sneakily went here. And of course, if I move my king, it's stalemate. So after this check, he understood that I wasn't going to stalemate him and that it wasn't a bullet game. And he resigned.